The Anatomical Basis for USG-DN, Ultrasound Guided Dry Needling, by Dr. Lakshmi Vas. Dr. Lakshmi Vas is the director at Ashirvad Institute for Pain Management and Research, which is also a center for university recognized postgraduate fellowship in chronic pain medicine. Ma'am is an honorary consultant in pain medicine at KEM Hospital and St. GS Medical College. She is also honorary consultant at National Burn Center, Airoli. She has developed a new etiopathogenesis and an effective treatment regimen for CRPS that reverses not only pain but also the disability of CRPS. She has proposed a new concept of neuromyopathy to explain motor neuropathy, which is a vital component of neuropathic pain. She has also developed a ketamine-based protocol for management of burns pain. She has been vital in proposing and developing the curriculum for fellowship in chronic pain medicine for MUHS fellowships. She has also received the Best Researcher Award in 2015 at International Conference on Recent Advances in Pain. She has more than 100 international publications to her credit. She has written more than 10 chapters in various textbooks. So let's go ahead with the lecture, and I hand it over to Dr. Lakshmi Vas.
Yeah, this is the presentation that was meant to be there. So I hope whatever hiccups we had to have during the workshop is already over. So now it will be a smooth sailing, I believe. Okay, so the anatomic basis of ultrasound guided dry needling for back problems is the topic that I'll be talking about just now. See, as I said, in somewhere around 1994, I did a bungee jump in New Zealand, Queenstown. I did not know at that time I'll be doing a bungee jump of my professional life as well. When people are thinking of retiring, I went back into pain management as a novice. Though I had been doing acute pain for years and years, chronic pain was a new animal with which I was not really familiar. So it was really a bungee jump. And so as I was talking before, most of the interventions intended for pain in the back they target either nerves or joints. Transforaminal epidural, nerve root block, sympathetic ganglion block, or an interlaminar epidural as we normally do, is the anesthesia epidural. Or there are procedures like facet block or discogram or SI joint injections. So as you can see, most of these interventions target nerves or joints. There is no mention of muscle anywhere. So all the fluoroscopy guided interventions, again, transforaminal epidural. This is a patient post-surgical pain where the epidural dye spread you can see in the epidural space like this, lateral view, whatever. All these people are taught in excellent detail about how to do interventions to target nerves. This, of course, is the Christmas tree appearance. So, what is dry needling? Intramuscular stimulation or dry needling is the name given to an intervention where very fine 32 gauge solid needles are inserted into muscles to relieve the myofascial pain. Because it is a solid needle without any orifice in it, it can afford to be as thin as 32 or even 34 gauge. So the action of where the needle produces immediate analgesic effect, he called it the needle effect. This is something which always comes. The moment a needle is put in, there may be the pain during the needle introduction, but the patient's own pain becomes very less after that. So presently, when somebody says dry needling, this is a term which refers to blind placement of needles, mainly by physiotherapists, sometimes sports medicine people or neurologists. Basically, it is without vision. And the needles which are used in usual dry needling is about 1.3 centimeters to maybe 4 centimeters. Maybe a few adventurous souls will go to 5 centimeter or 6 centimeters. Whereas what we are talking about and will be teaching you today is something which goes from 1.3 centimeters right up to 12 centimeters to reach the depths of muscles. By the way, though the needle is used, needle is only the tool, but it has no connection to acupuncture. It has no connection whatsoever, either in philosophy or in the technique or in the effects. Acupuncture is a separate science by itself, which I do use sometimes. I think one of the videos shows that, but acupuncture is not what I use for pain management. Now, 16 years ago, I used to do all the blocks, neural blocks, very well with textbook perfection. Blocks would give pain relief for a few days or weeks, but then patients still returned with recurrence of pains in spite of expensive blocks. And I was very perplexed. I was used to working as an honorary without getting any money. Here I was in private practice charging patients money and then not providing the result. So I was on the verge of thinking, why am I working like this at all? I am not happy with the 30%, 40% reliefs that I am providing. If this is the way I am going to work, I might as well call it a day and retire. That was where I was. But then I had been trained in acupuncture already, so I tried acupuncture. But then found that acupuncture provides very temporary relief and pains routinely recur. So there I was back to square one, temporary reliefs. And I was beginning to feel like a con artist. Then it so happened I went to Bangkok to speak at some conference on pediatric anesthesia, of which I was an expert. And I met Dr. Chan Gun from Canada. So he was kind enough to allow me to attend his workshop even though I was not registered. So I learned dry needling, which he calls as intramuscular stimulation. So this IMS technique is something like very quick needle insertion. Few manipulations are done and then the needle is immediately relieved. Usually about 5 to 6 needles are used, up to maybe 10. So what I found was dry needling as taught by Chan Gun and as practiced by physiotherapists today, it produced incomplete results which were not sustained. So this is corroborated by a recent study in 2017, Gatti et al. These are physiotherapists, by the way. They have studied the effectiveness and they've done a meta-analysis, effectiveness of trigger point dry needling. So please note, this is a very specific thing. Dry needling is meant only for trigger points. It's not meant for any other point in the muscle. So what they found was there is low quality to moderate evidence to support that DN is more effective than no treatment. That is, it is like they may get temporary relief, but there is no relief at all in the long term. Long-term benefit is currently lacking. So these results are very different from what we see with ultrasound guided dry needling at our center today. But when I started, I was here. I was in a situation where I was doing dry needling, but I was not producing any long-term effects. So because I was not happy and I was not ready to give up something which might work, at least which works temporarily, and it's cheap compared to neural interventions, I took the technique, I modified it. I used a few more needles as we do in acupuncture, and I left them in situ for longer periods as we do in acupuncture. This is dry needling, but I was taking a few techniques from acupuncture and adding it to dry needling. And then more importantly, I use this as an adjuvant therapy in patients who had failed neural interventions or blocks. This is I think the operative thing which changed everything for us. In the sense, there are people who do dry needling, even doctors who do dry needling, they do only dry needling. They don't do interventions. And then interventionalists, of course, do only interventions. So here I was combining the two techniques, and this produced wonderful results. So with the addition of this extended DN, when I say extended DN, My needle numbers were higher, not 6, maybe about 15 to 20. Patients were not only improving, but they were showing astounding results within no time. So, this has been the story with dry needling with me. I have produced the result first, and then I have tried to find reasons why it is working after all. So, the improvements appear to be consistent and predictable, even though my understanding of muscle anatomy made my dry needling technique suboptimal. I barely knew muscle anatomy, you can say. I knew as much as any academically active person in anesthesia would. That's it. So I realized that I knew too little of muscle anatomy to understand why I was getting these fantastic results. So I went back to Cadaver Lab. That is where I met Rakhi for the first time for understanding muscle anatomy. So I scheduled about 15 days out of my time to learn about anatomy. That is how ignorant I was, that I thought I would learn muscle anatomy within a fortnight. But then I found that I didn't understand anything in a fortnight. And this dissection went on every day almost for 6 months. But then, even though I spent 6 months, my understanding of anatomy was very much clearer and my dry needling technique improved. When I say improved, it began to encompass a new understanding of pain. So it is not about the technique of dry needling, but about the new understanding of pain that comes when you do the dry needling. Because when you do dry needling, you keep producing positive results. And you have to ask yourself, why? What is it that I am doing right here to produce these results? This is how dry needling became ultrasound guided dry needling. I have a few more slides to explain the differences, because everybody thinks dry needling is a few needles stuck here and there. Some people even derogatorily believe it is some paramedical technique. Some others think that it is some nonsensical technique. So that is the reason why that I am trying to explain to you how scientific ultrasound guided dry needling is. Because it was born out of a necessity. It stayed because it was effective. And then, more than anything else, it has taught me much, much more than any other textbook of chronic pain could. Post Cadaver Lab experience, we understood muscle anatomy a lot better. More importantly, I understood that concept of agonist muscles, antagonist muscles, fixators, facilitators for every movement. Muscles never act in isolation. If one muscle is acting, some other muscle somewhere else is stretching. So myofascial pain and functional impairment are two sides of the same coin. So if there is a myofascial problem, there is myofascial pain. That is one component of the whole problem. The other more important component is the functional impairment. Functional impairment is a feature of every single chronic pain. So I really am astonished that someone else before me has not stumbled onto this fact that if there is functional impairment, it cannot be just because of the pain. There might be a primary cause itself. Anyway, addressing only the most painful spot in an individual muscle, as physiotherapists do, in isolation is futile. Trigger point dry needling, as was mentioned in that physiotherapy paper, is something which is futile. It is doomed to failure because it is addressing only painful areas, and the problem is a lot more than the painful areas. My approach shifted to addressing the whole muscle harboring the myofascial trigger points, and thence to co-working muscle groups rather than individual muscles. Thus, after the dissection, in a single session of dry needling, I would be needling agonist muscle, antagonist muscle, and synergists, fixators, muscles needed to be collectively addressed with at least 3 to 4 needles per muscle. So usually I land up putting in about 60, 70, and if I have a patient who's very cooperative and the problem is a lot, I may go even to 100 needles in most pain conditions. So pain, as I was saying, trigger point dry needling of only the painful area is futile. That is because pain and tenderness forms just the tip of the iceberg. The whole iceberg is in the muscle, in the co-working muscles as well. The actual pathology lies deeper in the whole of the muscle and its functional counterparts. Myofascial trigger points are peculiar entities. They produce not just pain, but they cause tautening of the muscle fibers, called taut bands. So muscles suffer mechanical embarrassment the moment there is a myofascial trigger point, which they transfer to the joints that they move, and the same mechanical embarrassment is also transferred to the antagonists and other muscles. Muscle is not inert. It is a dynamic structure, keeps contracting and functioning in spite of injuries, myofascial trigger points, etc., which worsens the whole pathology on a daily basis. So, coming back to what is practiced by other pain specialists across the world, is that my reading showed nerve-centric information that acknowledges only somatosensory nervous system. In this background, that I found dry needling producing wonderful results in conditions considered untreatable. So I was still in that mode of believing what I read in textbooks. I was too new then. You see, 15 years ago, I was just finding these results. So I was also very skeptical. And I've been trained to be skeptical as a scientist, as a person who publishes papers. If I find a result, if I quote a result, it has to stand the test of time and repeated confirmations. So I kept thinking that I doubted every one of my findings. If somebody improved, I would keep asking that patient, are you really all right? Are you really walking 15 minutes instead of 1 minute that you were doing before? And I kept on checking and rechecking results. But I found that all the results held true. Once the patient improves, that improvement is there to stay, especially disability improvements. And the results of dry needling continue to be predictable and reproducible with clockwork precision. The efficacy of dry needling indicated that there had to be a different logic to pain than what is written in textbooks. And a perspective had to be changed or developed, incorporating a paradigm shift in the way we look at chronic pain. This is what I came to this conclusion somewhere in 2006, I suppose. So then I started looking at neuropathy as neuropathy of motor nerves. Don't look at neuropathy by definition involves only the somatosensory nervous system. You attend any lecture on neuropathy, you read any textbook chapter on neuropathy, you will find that they will give a definition that neuropathy means a lesion in the somatosensory nervous system. So this definition makes it very easy for doctors to put things in place. You know, in our minds, we are very logical and systematic people. And we like to understand everything. Neuropathy means, okay, somatosensory system. PHN means it is the dermatomes which are involved. Or if there is a radicular problem, which are the dermatomes involved, I want to go there. So this is the way we classify things in our head. So this definition of somatosensory nervous system makes it very easy for us to classify in our minds the information that has been sort of tossed here and there together. But if you try to include muscles into it, then the whole thing becomes chaotic. As a result, what these authors have done is they've simply kept the myofascial system out of the neuropathic domain. In fact, in the first paper of Treed et al., they even go so far as to say, they specifically say, the myofascial pains are definitely not included in neuropathic pains. They consider these to be something secondary because of disuse, because of atrophy or whatever. I don't know what they think or why they think it, but it is myofascial system is kept out of this definition. But what I found in real life from my patients. My patients have been my teachers, not any textbook. So I learned to look at neuropathy as neuropathy of motor nerves or neuromyopathy affecting the muscles to explain the ubiquitous presence of myofascial pain syndromes in every single chronic pain. If you think post-herpetic neuralgia is a classical neuropathic pain, there also muscles are involved. If you think there is a central pain like a post-stroke pain, there also muscles are involved. If you look at even something like a thalamic pain, the muscles are involved. So let us look at dry needling versus ultrasound guided dry needling. The differences is not in at how they are performed. It's just 6 needles, it's just kept for a second, etc. That is not the main idea difference between dry needling and ultrasound guided dry needling. It is in the conceptual understanding of pain itself. When you think of pain as coming from the myofascial system, automatically you have to look at all the muscles involved in that particular area of pain, not just one trigger point. The muscles become the primary expressors of pain because muscle reaction to neural irritation and excessive firing at the neuromuscular junction is not just a passive reflection of irritation. The moment there is irritation of the motor nerve and the neuromuscular junction, there is an active process of muscle spasm which sets in. And when muscle spasm stays for a while, myofascial trigger points are formed. Once these are formed, they become swayambhu. This is a word which I can use with Indians because we are all familiar with this swayambhu. That is, it becomes independent of itself. It is a self-sustaining source of inflammation and nociception. So this is what makes me do as many needles as is needed in ultrasound guided dry needling. So there is a paper by Wang and Yu and many others who have hypothesized that there is an excessive acetylcholine release at the neuromuscular junction. They don't talk about neuropathy, by the way. These are researchers who are only looking at the myofascial system. See, in the academia, you have two separate groups. The myofascial people don't look at neuropathy people, and neuropathy people look down on the myofascial people. So these two people never come together to talk. And ultrasound guided dry needling is all about combining these two aspects. So this acetylcholine release perpetuates a contracture of associated muscle fibers, resulting in increased metabolic demands in the muscle. So here, this is your myosin, this is your actin, this is your Z line, M line is the center of the myosin, Z line here. What happens normally when it is relaxed, it is about the inter-Z interval is this much. Whereas when it is contracted, it becomes that much less because the actin slides over the myosin. So let me try to explain here the physiology of the myofascial trigger point. I'm going into a lot of detail because this is what one has to understand about how pain generates. So if this is the motor nerve end plate, the impulses are coming here, the acetylcholine is getting released here, which is also getting reabsorbed and broken down, etc. The acetylcholine which gets into the muscle will produce a muscle contraction. There is a constant leak of acetylcholine, a very low leak which keeps happening all the time, which gives rise to what is called as miniature end plate potentials. This is a normal phenomenon. In everybody this happens. But there are some patients, or rather whenever there is a motor nerve is irritated, there is spontaneous electrical activity which consists of continuous low amplitude noise. When I say noise, it is something, the recording on the EMG, action potentials, and this is generated at an MTRP. This SEA or end plate noise is seen only at the MTRP loci and not in other places in the muscle. This increase in miniature end plate potentials was termed end plate noise by Simmons. So this is what end plate noise looks like on an EMG. This is an EMG of miniature end plate potentials. One potential, another potential, in between is clean. Whereas in end plate noise, this is the kind of up, down, up, down, up, down irritations that you see. When you see this kind of a situation, it causes local sarcomere contracture. And that causes sarcomere is completely contracted. And when it is contracted for a long time, these myosin gets stuck at the Z line. And this produces, because this is an event which consumes a lot of nutrients and oxygen, there is local ischemia, acidosis, and local energy crisis. This is the hypothesis of energy crisis, integrated trigger point hypothesis of local energy crisis. So this local energy crisis will lead to inflammatory mediators which cause peripheral sensitization of the afferent nerves there. And then this causes nociception and pain. So the moment there is an MTRP, there is nociception and pain coming in. And then there is the motor effects of it. That's a different issue, the palpable bands which influence the other muscles. But the first thing that happens is nociception and pain at the myofascial trigger point. And then when you have to understand that there is something called as the fright-flight reflex. To execute the fright-flight reflex, muscles have a tremendous amount of sympathetic nervous system fibers. This is because to run away from a fright or a snake or a tiger, one has to mobilize the muscles. To mobilize the muscles, there has to be nutrition to the muscles. So there are lot of vasodilator fibers available inside the muscle. So these fibers also carry pain, and that is where the autonomic stimulation comes in. Once autonomic stimulation comes, the pain becomes a very different category of pain. Anyway, if you look at the muscle which looks like this normally, because of this continuous end plate noise, you develop little nodules like this, MTRPs, in the muscle. And J. Shah et al., they have done a wonderful work. They developed needles of 32 gauge needles, which they inserted into the MTRP areas. And in addition, though this is a 32 gauge needle, it's a hypodermic needle, in the sense it's got an orifice, so they could draw out the fluid from the MTRP. And what they did was, they drew the fluid as soon as they entered, and then after the local twitch reflex, which I'll be talking about a little later, the needle effect which happens, after that they took another sample of the fluid from around the MTRPs, and they found that the inflammatory mediators were very much reduced. So they unequivocally proved that MTRPs are local sources of inflammation and pain. So myofascial trigger points, there are two types. Active myofascial trigger points, they are spontaneously painful. If you are sitting here and you are having a pain here, that is a spontaneous active MTRP. But if you don't have any pain, somebody touches you here and then you get a pain, that is a latent MTRP. These are stages of the MTRP. First, MTRP is formed, it is a latent. It is not really painful by itself, but it is just causing mechanical embarrassment to the muscle, and it can still refer pains and other things, but it is at a very low level. But after some time, it becomes active. As it stays there for a long time and lot of inflammatory mediator reaction happens, then it becomes an active MTRP. It is spontaneously painful, and muscle movements become painful. So muscle anatomy provides a very different logic to the understanding of pain, particularly if one understands that muscles are the primary pain generators in most pains. See, don't look at dermatomes in pains, but look at myotomes. You will explain lot of pains when you look at it that way. They are also the expressors. Not only are they generators of pain, they are expressors of neuropathic pain. If there is a lesion in a nerve, the only way the nerve can express itself is by increased firing at the neuromuscular junction, which causes muscle spasm and then formation of myofascial trigger points. Initially, they are passive, not spontaneously painful, but painful on pressure. I am repeating things here so that I sort of drive it into your understanding. Later, they become active. Active MTRPs are spontaneously painful, and these can sensitize the afferent nociceptive nerves. The muscles have a lot of nerves in them. This is an area which has not been researched at all. The nerves in a muscle are considered to be motor, and that's it. Muscles actually have an abundance of free nerve endings which can become pain sensing receptors. So there is, I have coined a term called musculosensory nerves for this. So to explain why their muscles become so painful. Anybody who's had a, am I on? Yeah, it's okay. So anybody who's had a cramp can attest to the capability of a muscle to feel pain. In addition to the pain, there is also stiffness, weakness, and restricted range of movement. So ultrasound guided visualization of dry needling provides novel insights into muscle function. This is a very rarefied area that I have entered in this. In the sense, when you do dry needling, you do something, you understand something, maybe, but when you look at it with ultrasound, you are seeing in real time what is happening. This visualization emphasizes that muscles seldom act in isolation. LTRs, that is the local twitch reflex, I'll show you a video of that in a bit. Local twitch reflexes are routinely visualized in co-working muscles. So not just the muscle which is, if you have trapezius pain here, let us say, you not only have an LTR here, but when you do a needling here in the teres, you will get another LTR. So these are observations of mine over the years, and that's how I look at co-working muscles in a big way. And anyway, there is never one MTRP sitting in one muscle. They always occur in clusters. So there is a much higher abundance of MTRPs than is currently assumed by whoever is working in the field. MTRPs in flexor muscles apparently cause strain in the muscle, leading to reactive MTRPs in other agonists. When I say other agonist, let us say, if your flexor carpi radialis, which bends the wrist, is involved, it will produce some embarrassment in the flexor digitorum superficialis and profundus, which also go here. So these are the co-working muscles, which they are also agonists. But in addition, it also affects the antagonists, the synergistic muscles, and the fixators. Thus, pain and tenderness form just the tip of the iceberg. Another repetition. Please get this into your head. Pain and tenderness form just the tip of the iceberg, while the actual pathology of myofascial pains and neuropathic pains lies in the whole muscle and its functional counterparts. Most of the local twitch reflexes seen during ultrasound guided dry needling would neither be visible nor sought by the present DN practitioners. Those who do dry needling without this vision, they won't know at all. So they may also find it very funny that I am going and doing needling somewhere else where there is no pain apparently. But there is a very scientific reason, as I have explained till now. If you people have any questions in this, please note it down and I'll be answering these later. This is the ultrasound visualization revolutionizes dry needling into USGDN. So this is the reason why I call my technique ultrasound guided dry needling, because the information which has been given to me by ultrasound has converted dry needling into something which is very different from whatever is called as dry needling by physiotherapists. They are as different as chalk and cheese. It's much more extensive as well as comprehensive version of DN. Ultrasound guided dry needling addresses the interrelated functioning of various structures in the body that work as parts of a whole. One muscle works as a part of that movement. All the other muscles which are involved in the same movement are the other counterparts. And when one part suffers, it involves all the others. This is the symbiotic existence of universe. Everything involves everybody. So in the same way, muscles also. Myofascial pain becomes a neuromuscular problem, and neuropathic pains become neuromyopathies. So ultrasound guided dry needling targets the structural impairment caused by the taut band. Not only does it affect the pain in the muscle, but also the taut band. When it affects the taut band, automatically it addresses the disability that comes with pain. And thus both pain and disability are addressed simultaneously with dry needling. This makes USGDN a specific treatment option for all chronic pains like neuropathic pains, cancer pains, back pains, arthritic pains. You can name any pain and I'll tell you how to do dry needling for it, USGDN for it. Now, these are videos which will show a physiotherapist doing the dry needling. Needle is going in blindly, and I can tell you with my ultrasound experience, if he puts a 40 mm needle here, he'll enter the lung. Here he is putting a 25 mm. So he leaves it for about maybe 30 seconds, and then after that he will come and take it out. Take it out. See, I am doing a more graphic representation of that. The audio here is not there. You just put the needle and do a little bit of pumping and take it out. That is dry needling. But if you look at all the other needles which are here, they have been there for about 15 minutes already. So this is USGDN. Look at the number of needles. Whereas DN will be just that one needle coming in and going out. Now, I've been talking about local twitch reflex. Please watch this video carefully. The needle is coming in and then there is a jerk. That twitch is called the local twitch reflex. I'll play the video again. This is the biceps femoris muscle in the thigh, back of the thigh, in a patient of back pain. Needle is coming in, jump. Again I'll play. This is something which you keep seeing. Needle coming in, twitch. So this is something which we keep seeing as we are doing USGDN. We keep seeing cascades of these LTRs going on. So I don't really look at, there are certain ways of examining for a myofascial trigger point done by physiotherapists. I don't even do that because I see it all the time anyway as LTRs.
Should be needled in a posterior
Now,
to anterior
ultrasound guided
cephalad
dry
direction.
needling has the very great advantage that pleura is seen as well as this. My needle is just here in the intercostal muscle. So this is the advantage I have, that I will never enter the pleura with ultrasound guidance, nor the peritoneum, nor any big vessel. So I become fearless because I have vision. Whereas when they are doing something like this, I can tell you they have hearts in their mouth. And there have been many instances of pneumothorax and other problems. And as a result, they always stay with small needles and they are very cautious, and they should be cautious. So these are the differences between dry needling and USGDN, and they start with the basic concepts as I said. So once again I'm reiterating, only painful points are targeted by dry needling, and very few needles are used for a very superficial relief of few painful points. USGDN targets the whole muscle with the pain and also its counterparts. So the goal is pain as well as disability. Then MTRPs are confirmed with pain on digital pressure. I couldn't make videos for this, so I'll show it to you. I hope, yeah, I'm seeing. Let's say I have a trigger point here. What you have to do is, I don't know if you can see my nail bed. Now I think you can. Can you see my nail bed? Can you? Okay, there. Can you see? I can't make out. Okay, here. Okay, when you press enough that my nail bed blanches. That is the kind of pressure you should use to elicit a myofascial trigger point. If I have a myofascial trigger point here, I will not be able to press so hard. Then this is called palpation. This is how they detect MTRPs, and then if they find that the patient is getting pain or is jumping, then they will go and put a needle there. Now, there is another thing called how to find the this one, palpable band or the taut band. For that, the finger is kept at 90 degrees. Oh, sorry, it's kept at 90 degrees, and then you do this like you're strumming a guitar. Am I seen? Yeah, I think I'm seen now. If I wish to, this is the way I am doing the palpation for the taut band. If there are bands, you can feel them. So usually 6 to 10 needles per session are used in dry needling. In USGDN, 50 to 60 needles. And they usually do about 6 sessions. I may do 8 to 10 sessions, or I may even go up to 20 sessions in recalcitrant patients. This 20 sessions is not because the needling is ineffective, but because we want to take the patients to a level of ability that they want to do. And like if somebody wants to run the Bombay Marathon, I have to take her to 20 sessions. If she is somebody who's happy to just go down and buy vegetables and come back home, I may finish it at 10 sessions. So there is a prudent and very real fear of complications in DN, and they use short needles, and they never usually hit the deep-seated MTRPs. Whereas because of the visualization, we can go anywhere and catch the problems, especially multifidus, which is such a deep muscle, and we can address it. Quadratus lumborum, you will be seeing all these muscles, piriformis, gemelli, and when you are needling the biceps femoris, where the sciatic nerve is right there, so you know where to go, how deep to go, etc. The problems of complications of dry needling are bruising, neurovascular and visceral injuries. There have been even pericardial effusions, pericardial bleeding reported with dry needling, and serious complications like pneumothorax. In ultrasound guided dry needling, bruising is the only complication because USG clearly shows where you are going. So I have spent a lot of time on dry needling itself because this is a dry needling workshop. Now, why have doctors been so dismissive of dry needling and as a technique, and why has it not become as popular as it is in Ashirvad? Because muscle subtleties, abnormalities are too subtle to be picked up by gross investigations like CT, MRI, etc. So these are our staple investigations. They just don't pick up muscle abnormalities. MRI shows muscles here. How many people know which muscle is where here to know whether there is an abnormality? How often does one look at these muscles to know the abnormality? So this is a bus which has been missed right from its beginning. It is myofascial contribution to pain is very difficult to assess and ascertain, especially when you think that it is the pain which is preventing people from not moving. So it is almost always unaddressed. Muscle component is always unaddressed, and it is usually dismissed as, oh, just some muscle pains, spasms. So it's like, if you have an injury, it has to be spasm, no problem. And then let us say there is a major surgery is done. After that, the patient is told, go and do physiotherapy. Surgeon has nothing more to do with the patient, because they don't have an access to a treatment tool for that. They don't know what to do with these muscles, so they simply refer to physiotherapists. So physiotherapy, and now recently Botox. Everybody is very fond of Botox because it's an expensive treatment with very good rewards. Nothing wrong with it. I use Botox myself. Now, ultrasound can show muscle abnormalities very well. This is an abnormal muscle. It is all white. a normal muscle looks more like this. The outlines are very clear. It is, the main thing is black. I'll be showing another slide to show all these. But here in this slide, I have put this to show the dynamic events that you can see with ultrasound. Can you see this shivering in this muscle? This is a dynamic event which you are seeing. You can call this visible pain. This patient came to me with lot of pain in the triceps, and I put the probe on it, and if I see something like this, I know that if the patient says the pain is 10, it is 100% 10. We see this routinely. These are CRPS muscles where the patient has lot of pain in these muscles, and you can see the shivering going on there inside these muscles. It is not the probe moving, it's the muscles moving. So now if you look at structural anatomy of muscle and corresponding sonoanatomy, this is how a muscle is designed. The muscle cell, many muscle cells or fibers form a bundle called the fascicle, and many fascicles make up the muscle. So what you see in ultrasound is the muscle fibers are seen as, the red muscle in this figure will look as dark. This is called hypoechoic. The dark muscle, hypoechoic muscle, is a normal muscle, and the connective tissue framework looks as bright curvilinear echoes. These white echoes here, this is not abnormal. These are the connective tissue septae which are normal. What happens in something like this is there is hardly any muscle and only connective tissue or fibrosis. This is seen in ultrasound. So muscle abnormalities can be differentiated. You can diagnose CRPS with ultrasound itself. Though of course I have reported this in, I think, 10 publications probably, but I don't think any other group has really looked at this problem, because ultrasound is mainly an ultrasonologist domain. The diagnostic ultrasound is not attempted by pain physicians or anesthetists. They know how to use an ultrasound for doing something, but they don't know how to look at the structural abnormalities. And ultrasonologists themselves don't see these conditions. Like when I showed my CRPS findings to a very senior, very good musculoskeletal ultrasonologist, he said, "Madam, I have never seen anything like this," because these patients are never referred to them. And just now I am doing a study of failed back surgery with him. And he told me, "Madam Kapli, can you please come and teach me? I'll come to your place, you teach me how to do the ultrasound." I started laughing. I said, "Ashwin, you have taught me how to hold a probe, where I will teach you ultrasound." He said, "No, we don't look at these things, madam. So you please show me what you want." So I am in the rarefied area, which is a in-between area for two specialties. So anyway, this is what an abnormal muscle looks like. This is a normal muscle, this is an abnormal muscle. So about pain from muscles, there is a lot of work done by Siegfried Menz, who has said that in acute muscle pain, there is sensitization of local muscle nociceptors. Continuous activation of nociceptors can lead to central sensitization of dorsal horn neurons. Muscle nociceptive afferents are specially effective in inducing neuroplasty. That means spinal sensitization is the given with muscle pain. This is another group, Wall and Wolf. So muscle pain characteristics are, they go to this anterior cingulate gyrus, which is involved with depression and mood and other things, emotional and affective components of pain. And muscle pain is inhibited by descending pain modulating pathways. So mind can control pain because of this, muscle pains. And the infrastructure that has led to the postulation of gate control theory of cutaneous sensory nerves is also present for motor nerves. So don't just look at cutaneous sensation or sensory system, somatosensory system, but also look at motor system for pains. Neuropathy in motor nerves is as likely as sensory neuropathy. Another different perspective is chronic pain is a critical public health problem, and 95% with chronic pain have myofascial pains. 95% is a huge, huge number. So the association cannot be just because of disuse and atrophy. So after 17 years of chronic pain management, the nerve blocks relieve pain. Dry needling relieves not only pain but also relieves stiffness, reduces the swelling, thereby enabling physical therapy to reverse disability. Dry needling is actually the philosopher's stone of pain management. This is the reason why I have been so obsessive compulsive about dry needling, and I'm trying to teach it. And this time I'm happy that there are some enough candidates to understand. If you people pick it up, don't believe what I say. Whatever I have said, whatever I have shown in these slides, you need not believe it. Do it for yourself and you will find whatever I have found can be found by you. I can guarantee you that. Use ultrasound. When I say ultrasound guided dry needling, let's say you don't have an ultrasound machine. So you can still do ultrasound guided dry needling by, let us say for back, you get an ultrasound done by an expert ultrasonologist and ask him to tell you the depths of these muscles. How deep is the spinalis and multifidus? How deep is the quadratus lumborum? So you know which needle can go safely without injuring any structure. So it is still ultrasound guided, though you are not holding a probe when you are putting the needle. So why interventions fail? I think I'm running out of time, or I have gone over time. I'm still in time? Okay, I'll run through the rest of the slides. Okay, most interventions, the whole idea of why I went into pain management, or rather dry needling 16 years ago, was because interventions failed. They fail because of a lack of understanding that back, especially in back pain, is a complex apparatus with a multitude of interconnected mechanics. If you, for an example, if you look at the nerve root foramen, it is here. The nerve is coming here, nerve root is coming here. A protruded disc can press on the nerve, but at this equally competently, a facetal problem can also press on the nerve like this. So facetogenic and discogenic pains are classifications which make it easy for you to understand what this pain is about. That's all. But that is not what happens in a patient. A facetogenic pain can look like discogenic pain and vice versa. This disc, this facet has fluid in it. It is pressing on the nerve here. It can produce exact radiculopathy like a disc here. So you can see this is the nerve root here. And this nerve root, if it is compressed, the same nerve root is going and supplying the erector spinae muscles. So obviously if this nerve root is irritated, it causes muscle spasm here, and which in turn will compress this nerve a little more. So both facetal and disc pathology can mimic each other.
Progress.
Okay. So the interventions fail because of a lack of understanding that back is a complex apparatus with interconnected mechanics. So let us say you have spondylolysis here. The damage is here. It's right next to the nerve, abutting the nerve again. So everything is within millimeters of each other in the back, and they have physiologically also interconnected. Now, look, if you look at the genesis of back problems, I will deal more with this tomorrow, but I'll try to run. How much time do I have?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay, fine. So if you look at this is the spine, and this whole thing is the spine, and inside that these are the nerves, and look at the bulk of muscles. This is the psoas, this is the quadratus lumborum, this is the erector spinae group of muscles. And in addition, you have the abdominal oval, which forms the transversus abdominis and the rectus. So this is a complete unit of back pain. Now you have the muscle bulk here. This is the front psoas. And here is the back muscles here seen in a MRI. Back muscles. So if you look at it, the bulk of muscle is easily 3 times that of the bone or the much more than the nerves. So if you have, this is a normal disc, nice round oval, but when there is muscle spasm, it compresses the disc. It also compresses the facet. So just muscle spasm can produce discogenic-like pains, it can produce facetogenic-like pains. A normal facet looks like this, but when compressed, it will be like this. So, and in addition to these big muscles, you have these small muscles, intertransversus muscle, the rotatoris, the multifidus, etc., which I'll be talking about in a minute or so. Role of muscles in the genesis of back pain. Sedentary lifestyle leads to stiffening of muscles, especially sitting in chairs is one of the worst things that you can do to yourself, because your psoas goes into spasm straight away. Psoas muscle is contracted when you sit in a chair, and this leads to stiffening over period of time. It's not spasm, it's action of the psoas which can lead to stiffening if it is not stretched. Eventually, taut bands develop in these muscles which can together compress the spine and discs. So paravertebral muscles are very powerful muscles. The stiff muscles are constantly vulnerable to strain, sprains, micro tears of muscle fibers. An elastic muscle will bend any which way, stretch any which way, but a muscle which is stiffened because of constantly held posture, etc., over years, it can be vulnerable to strain, sprain, micro tears, etc., and also the taut bands which develop in it. So in addition to facetal irritation, the annular tear in a disc will cause spasm. The mechanical effect of disc bulges will cause muscle spasm. Everything goes towards muscle spasm. So basically you need to look at the interconnected mechanisms in back pain. So if you look at the layers of back muscles, the most superficial layer will be the erector spinae, the central spinalis, the longissimus, and the iliocostalis. This is your quadratus lumborum. Deep inside are the rotatoris, interspinalis, spinotransversus, intertransversus, the quadratus lumborum. From the lateral aspect of quadratus lumborum, the transversus abdominis. So again, the same thing. This is the multifidus here, and I will not go into all these agonist antagonist for these movements, but I do want to mention about the psoas, the iliopsoas, the iliacus part and the psoas part. This is a very, very important muscle because this forms the front of the spine, whereas the erector spinae multifidus forms the back of the spine. So when you have a situation like this, this is your hip. So back muscle spasm, particularly of erector spinae and psoas, can strap the back in straight position. Any patient with back pain, you send him for X-ray, you will find that straightening of the lumbar curve. Straightening of the lumbar curve means muscle spasm is already there, and I'll be talking about all these things in mechanical back pain tomorrow. But loss of normal lumbar lordosis means there are a lot of problems going on already. This spasm can compress the vertebrae together to pressurize the discs and facets. Now, our traditional Indian postures are very good for all these things. Because the psoas, please look at this psoas. Psoas is coming like this and inserting into the lesser trochanter. Because of this, the moment you sit like this, as in Sukhasana or simply cross-legged posture or Padmasana, you have stretching of the psoas on a regular basis. Sitting down like this and getting up is enough to keep your back healthy. And then there are poses in yoga like the Bhadrasana, where there is an extreme stretch of the psoas. It literally straightens the spine out, but at the same time it's a very good exercise. It also stretches the adductors. And the extreme pose of Bhadrasana is this, where the head is touching the ground like this. So all these target the psoas. The yoga is probably one of the most scientifically formulated exercises for back, because in yoga it is believed back is the merudanda, where it's very important for spiritual practices. So yoga is obsessive compulsive about back health. Psoas spasm can cause bent posture of lumbar canal stenosis and the camptocormia of Parkinsonism. I'll not go into the details. This lady had a facetal denervation done somewhere else, and the next day she developed severe spasm like this. She developed psoas spasm after median branch RF, and she came to me after 2 months of that, and all I did was needling of the psoas, and see, she is standing like this. So you need to, if you know that these muscles exist, then symptoms literally fall into place when you see a patient. In fact, the patient will give you their diagnosis with their history. So shortening of muscles causes myriad manifestations. Shortening of the hamstring muscles, shortening of the psoas muscle, or intertransversus. This is the intertransversus muscle and the psoas muscle. I'll look into this later tomorrow. Then the piriformis syndrome. All these are nerve entrapment syndromes caused by muscle spasms and shortened muscles. So this can give you a radicular pain. This intertransversus spasm can give rise to radicular pains. What's going on? Yeah. Now, a taut band can also give rise to, this is the shortening of the muscle. This can give rise to pull at the tendons, giving burning, giving severe pain, bursitis, tendinopathies, and when this happens at the back of the knee, it will give you Baker's cyst. And when a muscle is in intense spasm, I told you that there are a lot of pain sensors in muscle, and many of them are temperature sensors. So the burning sensation that you have, the meralgia paresthetica, is actually an intense spasm of the vastus lateralis and vastus intermedius muscles. We have treated patients with this problem. We have not touched the lateral cutaneous nerve, but we have done needling of these vasti, and then burning goes away. It's routine for us. Many back pain patients, they come with this burning, which is relieved by the needling. So, and also you have to understand, skin has muscles. Why do you get podi orange? Because there are muscles in the skin, there are muscle elements floating in the skin. This is one thing which I learnt early on, because I used to find that there will be a nice delicate lady with very fragile skin all over the place. But in the areas of pain, there will be podi orange, and my needle will just not enter that skin. So I used to say, what is wrong with this? Why is the skin so tough in this lady? Then I realized that these muscles in the skin are causing the tightness and resistance to needle, because that resistance goes off if I leave the needle in for a minute or so. And also there are erector pili muscles here. These are the muscles which give rise to allodynia, hyperalgesia. This classical neuropathic pain symptoms like allodynia and hyperesthesia, hyperalgesia are mediated by the skin muscles. If you don't believe this, look at these patients when they come to you. Just do needling of the skin with a 13 mm needle, and you will see that these symptoms disappear after 2-3 sessions of needling. This mungi or insect crawling sensations, they disappear after you do needling, because I believe that these are the skin muscles which are contracting irregularly, so they feel as if something is moving there. So these are all things which I have learnt from my patients. They told me this, and mungi they go on, and then I do few sessions of needling. Mungi ahe ka azun? Nahi, gela. So where did it go? Why did it go? I have not gone and injected steroid near the nerve. A typical neuropathic symptom, why is it going away? So that is how I have reasoned it out that it is like this. So then the mind and muscle are always connected. Remember where I mentioned about the anterior cingulate gyrus getting the supply from the nociceptive pathway? Muscle mass in the back has very rich efferent as well as afferent nerve supply, which goes to anterior cingulate gyrus, emotion involved in emotion. So muscle pain, okay. So any muscle pain can give rise to depression and despondency, etc. So this is the cross section of the back muscles. All of you are familiar with the trifoliate look. This is the erector spinae, quadratus lumborum, and the psoas will be here. Same thing again. I was talking about the intertransversus muscle. This is the intertransversus muscle. This is the psoas. In between these two, there can be entrapment of the nerve root to give you identical symptoms of radiculopathy. The disc will be normal in this patient. I have a patient of this whom I'll be describing in mechanical back pain. So genesis of disc prolapse is not something that happens one terrible day at an inauspicious moment. The stage is set for years, and with constant muscle spasm of the psoas and the erector spinae, squeezing the vertebrae together to pressurize the discs, and finally they bulge out. I'll again be talking about this tomorrow. So there are cross connections between the facial layers, that the quadratus lumborum of the left is connected with the adductors and the hamstrings of the right. So these are things which I keep seeing in my needling. I do the adductor needling and the patient feels better here the next time. So these are very funny, peculiar connections which you will understand only if you understand the muscle anatomy and facial anatomy, which is very, very important. So you also have thoracolumbar fascia on one side is countered by the latissimus dorsi on the other side. So everything is interconnected. Nothing works in isolation. So complex apparatus of the back with multitude of nerve muscle joint. Joint is something which is very, very important, because let us say if there is synovium of the joints and the muscles that move the joint are connected. This is done because nature wants, if there is a problem which is causing synovial irritation, immediately you will change the position because of the pain. So this is meant as a protective mechanism, the connection between synovium and muscles. But unfortunately, when there is joint irritation, it works against you, in that this muscle spasm will cause severe pain in these patients. So SI joint problem, facet joint problem are all mediated through muscles. The muscles, if you treat the muscles, the pains will come down. But if the joint damage is too much, you have to go and do the radiofrequency ablation. But if you just do radiofrequency ablation and leave it, these patients will come back with pains afterwards. Synovial pain is expressed by the muscles and responds only after the synovial irritation is reduced. So all these are proofs. I'll be giving these slides to you people so you can look at them. I cannot go more into these slides because of time, so I will leave this. So interconnected mechanisms of nerves and muscles is even more interconnected, because the nerves cause muscle spasm and muscle spasms entrap the nerves again. So you just cannot escape one from the other. So maybe I'll try to deal with this tomorrow when I talk on mechanical back pain. So when we focus on facet alone or disc alone or muscles alone, it will be a case of completely missing the bus. When you look at treat back, treat the facet, treat the disc, treat the muscles. All three have to be treated. So you cannot become obsessive about muscles and say, I'll do only dry needling and everything will become all right. It will not. there are a few patients who will respond only to dry needling. There are a few patients who will respond only to a transforaminal epidural, or a few who may respond only to a median branch RF. But most patients, you will have to do the TFE, follow it up with needling. You will have to do a RF, follow it up with needling. And then there will be mechanical back pain patients are the only ones who will respond only to needling. So thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am, for the wonderful presentation. We are now open to taking questions. We have one question from our online delegate, Dr. Mahajan. His question is the 31 gauge needle easily visible under ultrasound?
Yes, there is a learning curve to it. You have to be good at ultrasound anyway. Steering needles under ultrasound is a skill in itself. Obviously, if you are using a 22 gauge needle or a 16 gauge needle, it's very easy. But seeing a 32 gauge needle is not exactly easy, but it can be easily done. I'll show you many slides where you will see the needles going through. You can see it very well, can be seen. But when you're doing deep muscles, you will see the jiggling, but you may not be able to see the needle in toto because of the acute angle in which you have to go.
Thank you, ma'am, for the answer. If anybody else from the audience has any questions,
Any of you have any questions?
they can be given a mic and they can ask the question. And even online candidates, anyone has a question, they can unmute themselves and directly interact with ma'am.
I want to ask, if a patient comes with a back pain, so how do we decide whether this patient will need any intervention in terms of a transforaminal facet based on our clinical diagnosis? Since we have treated with the help of a transforaminal epidural steroid injection, and then they come with the residual pain. So that's when we offer them this USG guided dry needling technique, or you directly go with the dry needling technique first and go for the steroid injection later?
Okay. This is quite a good question because it will tackle many things which I have spoken about. Let's say there is a patient who comes to you with just back pain. Maybe we should discuss this in detail later. Just back pain, no radicular pain. So obviously the nerve root is not embarrassed in this patient. The back is under trouble. This might be because of a facetal problem. This might be because of muscle spasm, or this might even be a mild pressure on the nerve where only the median branch of the dorsal root supplies your facet, but the lateral branch of the same dorsal root supplies the erector spinae. So the muscle spasm may be caused by a pressure on that. So when you have a patient like this, when a patient comes with radiculopathy, things are simple. If it's a typical radiculopathy, you have to rule out a disc. So you will ask for MRI. There is only backache or only pain till the knee, let us say. But in these patients, if you don't want to send them to the MRI, especially in today's time with you see COVID and patients not wanting to go into that area, you can do 3 sessions of needling in these patients. If all the symptoms disappear, I think she has put up a video of one patient where we have done 3 sessions and the patient is completely pain-free. So we'll see. Anyway, so if they become completely pain-free, why put them in to the risk of getting COVID from MRI gantry? So leave it. But if they don't do well, you have to do the MRI. You have to find out if there is a pressure from the disc. Because you see, if there is a annular tear, the chemical reaction is such that these patients will never settle with dry needling alone. So you have to do the steroid injection for them. So it's like probably all of you or those who are online also, if you have had any patient where you were puzzled as to what the symptoms were, you can put up those cases and we'll discuss them sometime or the other. Okay? So the most important thing for you is when to do what. dry needling is a simpler option, easier option, cheaper option. So you can try doing it. Having said that, dry needling in a patient who requires a block, let's say there is a annular tear or a disc bulge, these are patients with very severe pains. If you put needles in them, they will not come to you again because the pain will be so severe. So it is kinder to do the injection first and then go for needling. Because as I have said time and again, you are treating only the neural component with the injection. The muscular component has to be addressed. It's like clapping hands. This is the neural component, this is the muscular component. Both have to be addressed. There are a very few patients who don't have a very prominent muscular component. So these people will do very well with just physiotherapy. So these are the successes where dry needling is not done at all. Worldwide you have, everybody does only transforaminal epidurals for a disc problem. Why are we getting results in them? If everybody gets muscle spasms and myofascial triggers, why are they getting better? So there are categories of patients where somehow some of them are more prone to these formation of these myofascial triggers, who will always need dry needling after injection. There are a few, probably my imagination is that there may be about 20 to 30% of patients who don't need anything. You just give them one epidural and maybe another epidural, end of the story. But the vast majority of patients will be the ones who will not settle without dry needling. Whereas if you do dry needling after the injection, they will go all the way to complete normalcy. What I mean is, when I say complete normalcy, I am not talking about pain at all. I am talking about restoration of back mechanics. That is, a patient who's not able to, who's walking only 3 minutes, let us say, and not able to do anything else. First thing is to get their walk as is, where is, to something like 20, 30 minutes. If you can get them there, that is good. In addition, they should be bending, they should be sitting down. As I have shown you, to maintain the back mechanics well, they should be capable of doing everything. They are not to be frozen in a chair all the time. So one of the instructions many times I hear from surgeons is never sit down. Can you imagine this patient for life cannot sit down? Sitting down on the ground was an activity of human beings till chairs were invented. So it's not fair to deprive them of that, whatever it is. So they should go as normal as possible, but they should be taken there slowly. You can't tell them, okay, I've done 10 sessions of dry needling, go and sit down on the ground. No. You have to first tell them, first sit on a chair, on a sofa with one leg crossed. That way, that psoas is getting some exercise. Next, this psoas will get exercise. And then they will go to this. And then, so physiotherapy is a very important thing after dry needling. And then finally, if I can send them to a good yoga teacher, that is the end of the story. Because once yoga comes in, it is so obsessive compulsive about back health that they will not come back to you, which is very good. I am very happy if my patients don't ever come back to me, because that means I have been successful. And I am not suffering financially, whoever might be worried about it. I will not suffer financially, because these people, the moment anybody says back, they'll say, no, you have to go to our doctor, and they'll bring them. So you don't have to worry about the financial implications of losing a patient, but your aim should always be to see that your patient does not have to come back to you, and they should live a normal life. Because this is what I would want if I went to a doctor. If it is an achievable goal, you should achieve it. And if you achieve it, I can tell you, you will be a very happy person. Forget about, financial implications or whatever. The happiness and satisfaction of seeing somebody who has gone to normal is very nice. That's a price beyond money. And for the patient, of course, it's a very different ball game. Okay, anybody else?
What duration dry needling is done and what is the criteria for re-needling?
See, what duration is, each session will last about, the needles will remain in situ for about half an hour, each session. And then usually we do these needling twice a week in the first week or maybe the second week. We do twice a week till the pains come down. Pains always come down. So after, especially after a block, till the pains come down, it is twice a week. After the pains come down by, let us say, 40-50%, then we make it once a week. Then we make it once in 10 days, once in 15 days. So eventually, I think most patients require about, 10 sessions, 10 to 12 sessions. They are all like, they are ready to say goodbye to you happily. So this is the duration of treatment. But then there are some patients who are failed back surgery, or those who are mentally very upset by all these problems. You might have to hold their hand for a little longer.
The next question is from Dr. Kalpana Ravikumar. What is the fate of an MTRP if left untreated? Won't pharmacotherapy work here?
No, pharmacotherapy just cannot work here. Physiotherapy can work, because physiotherapy physically stretches it. When you stretch something like this, the MTRP in my biceps is going to come down to some extent. You are physically taking those actin myosin away from the Z line. Okay? Physiotherapy, well done physiotherapy can help in this. And pharmacotherapy has nothing to do with this. If you give muscle relaxant has no discretion. It does not know that it is supposed to go to the psoas or to your erector spinae. It goes to your biceps, it goes to your foot, it goes to your head, everywhere. And by the way, it also goes to the psoas. So the quantum which reaches muscle is very low when you give pharmacotherapy. Pharmacotherapy is only supportive and nothing more than that. Whereas physiotherapy is something very good. Traction, which is used in back, is another physical way of stretching these muscles, but these are not sustained. What the beauty of dry needling is, it sets into motion physiological relaxation. So you are, one of the simile I give to patients is like, your muscles are like an old rubber band which is shredding every time it is pulled. Whereas when we do dry needling and restore the elasticity to it, it becomes like a new rubber band. So that's the power of dry needling. Whereas pharmacotherapy, I use pharmacotherapy just as a bridge, nothing more.
I would like to combine the next two questions. Dr. Vishal is asking, are the needles used for dry needling different?
Pardon?
And Dr. Vikram has the question, how to decide the gauge of the needles?
See, the gauge of the needle is decided for you. These are acupuncture needles which come in only 32 gauge or 30 gauge or maybe 28 gauge. Thicker than that, you don't get acupuncture needles. If anybody is thinking of using hypodermic needles for dry needling, I would say try it on yourself first. You will know not to use it. You should use these filiform solid needles because they are very smooth and they are practically pain-free if they go into a normal muscle. So gauge of the needle is decided for you any which way. And then what was the first question?
The first question was, are the needles used for USG guided dry needling different? Are they different?
Yeah, they are definitely different. They are solid needles. Think of it this way. You take a ordinary 17 gauge needle or 16 gauge needle or 22 gauge needle. There is a hole in the needle and there is a wall all around it. So that if you take one small segment of the wall of that needle and make it into a solid needle, you can see how thin that needle is. Okay, that is why you can get 32 gauge needles. It's hair-like.
question. I think we'll take the last question. Should low dose steroid be given at trigger points using hypodermic needle?
Yeah. See, trigger points do help definitely, but they do not last, by the way. I do trigger points in patients who with very, very severe pains so that they become comfortable, but it is always to be followed up with needling. If you don't do needles, they'll come back with the same pains.
Wants to know from where can one get these needles?
Please ask my secretary Geeta, she'll give you the address. There is somebody who supplies this, and if somebody is adventurous, you can try importing it also. It's all available on the net. I haven't bothered because it's easier to get it from this person.